Hello, and welcome to our next episode of IP Workshop Live. Today, we'll be going through the process of revenue recovery from the initial target choosing and data collection steps all the way through to litigation and everything in between. My name is Ryan. I'm your host for IP Workshop Live, and today I'm joined by Jess, who is also from Mark Vision. Hi,
Hi,
Jess.
Ryan. Hi, thanks for having me.
So before we get into the actual steps of revenue recovery, I think it makes sense to talk about why now? Why is revenue recovery happening more now? Why are we talking about it?
Yeah, I think that's a great thought, right? I think more recently, every brand protection team is under a lot of pressure to save money and, even more pressure to prove ROI. So this is kind of the next evolution in brand protection programs.
Yeah. Um, I mean, brand protection in its more traditional sense does have, a positive ROI. You're saving your reputation. You're taking away fakes from the market. You're stopping the unauthorized sales. But yeah, really proving that positive ROI with numbers, I think, is something really valuable.
Yeah, right. I mean, it would be great to make enough money to, fund your program, right? At the end of the day, that would be, the true kind of goal of a revenue recovery program. And I think one of the other things to note is, the quality of data has just improved so much. And this allows brands to make better decisions because they can identify, these high value targets. They're going to be worthwhile to go after.
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, over the last few years, there's been developments in a number of fields, I think, that have made this possible. Legislation. I think things like the Inform Act help. Making this sort of information more transparent, and also platforms just providing more data to brands and to trusted flaggers to make these kind of decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. We talk a lot about sales and stock volume. And, stock volume has always been kind of an enigma because sellers can really choose to put whatever volume that they want. But now we're starting to be able to get more data on actual sales volume. And that can be a really good indicator of, high value target or somebody who's really moving a huge volume of counterfeits.
Yeah, it's a lot more trustworthy, I think, as a
Mhm.
number.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. So, I mean, now more than ever, it's, I think, probably the best time we've ever seen for brands to actually go straight at the counterfeiters and to make an actual impact with revenue recovery.
Yeah, absolutely.
And with that, let's jump into our first step. Um, our first step is going to be the initial investigation stage and the actual identifying of targets. Um, so let's talk through the actual criteria for whether this is feasible for your brand, if it's possible, if it's going to make financial sense. And I think this comes down to three main criteria, right? Um, the first one being as simple as having your IPR.
Yeah, absolutely. Having the right IPR is having IPR in general is essential to proving ownership and thusly infringement. And I think, it's also really important to, have the right IPR in the right class in the right location. So, if your brand does hats, and you're struggling with counterfeiters in China, you're going to want to make sure that you have class 25, which is, headwear, footwear, and clothing registered in China in order to be able to, use that IPR to protect yourself, both domestic and then in non-domestic countries.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds quite basic, but it's still quite surprising how often we're speaking to brands who say we're finding counterfeits, we want it to stop, and they just don't have the legal protection in place that is really a day one activity for brand protection.
100%. I think, before you start in on a revenue recovery program, that really is square one, step one, is, ensure that you've got the proper or IPR in the right class for the right countries. So, I think that's really a critical place to begin.
Yeah. Yeah, fully. The next thing would be showing, what we call the clarity of counterfeiting, the clarity of infringement. Um, if you're planning to run a revenue recovery program, having this, one-to-one exact fake is really important, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In these cases where they are identical replicas, one to one fakes, we do see around 100% success rate for these programs. And we are unfortunately seeing a huge issue with one to one super fakes, mirror quality, A1. They go by all of these different various names, and unfortunately, they're very popular on social media. Hashtag dupe on TikTok is a very scary place. There are a lot of high quality counterfeit products out there, and that can cause some really serious problems for brands.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the more you can prove that not only are they, they're not just taking your designs, but, they're using your name in their online shop fronts, they're using your name on the actual item, the packaging is stolen the same as well. The packaging is often a surprise, I think, because, a lot of brands put a lot of effort into making it, especially luxury brands, making the packaging really special, the opening experience. But yeah, if every part of this product from the whole sales process until it arrives is a mimicry of yours, then in terms of revenue recovery, I think you're in for a good start.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah. If you can prove that kind of bad faith, right? Like what you mentioned, like using the trademark in the shop name, really actively trying to dupe unsuspecting consumers. I think that, does go a really long way in identifying a really successful target. One of the other things I did want to talk about too is, products that are using similar trademark names and packaging, and kind of this idea of unfair competition. This is something that we can address with revenue recovery, although the success rate is a little lower. It's only around 80%. But there is some opportunity for that as well, in just kind of these bad faith actions that some sellers are taking.
Yeah, I mean, if you have cases where it's at least to you as a brand obvious infringement, but you'll have to put in a bit more effort to prove it in a court of law that they're infringing your IP. Yeah, it's. I mean, as you said, it's still feasible, but the chance that it doesn't go your way does start to creep in at this stage. Um, so the third criteria is to do with the target and their actual financial status. A revenue recovery program is not cheap. If any program that you're working with lawyers over a long period of time is a significant investment. So you're going to want to find a seller who has financial ability to give you the payout at the end of the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a couple of things, that you can look for in trying to identify these high volumes. And with high volume, comes probably pretty large bank accounts. You can work with a team that's trained to identify, these different patterns. And then finding high value targets that are, they have physical storage facilities, they're manufacturing, they've got warehouses. So trying to find these entities that not are just participating in one kind of portion of counterfeiting, but are an entire operation from tail to snout. So I think that goes a long way in trying to identify targets that are going to be the most financially viable.
Oh, yeah, it's huge. I mean, you're basically proving, with the manufacturing that these counterfeiters are able to keep producing these things, and then the warehouse where you can say, look, they've already got dozens, hundreds, thousands, however many of items that they were planning to sell already.
hmm Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, that shows that they're a major player, and they've got a significant operation.
Yeah. So these are the three main criteria that we are talking about for qualifying for a revenue recovery program. Make sure you have your IP, in the right class, in the right countries, so you actually have the legal protection. Make sure you can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is, you know, pure direct counterfeiting, and find a target that you can go after that's going to give you the payout you deserve.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this brings us on to our next step, which is data collection and case building. So once you've actually gone through these criteria, once you've made the decision, either with Mark Vision or doing this yourself, this is when you're going to start really compiling evidence. And the first thing is obviously to make this formal and structured and easy to find evidence, all the data you can collect.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this point is so critical because if you're not able to compile, very strong, valid data, your case is going to fall through. So, this step is very, very important to make sure that you kind of have all of your ducks in a row before you move on to kind of further steps in the process.
Yeah. I mean, a huge part of this is, well, as you already mentioned, Jess, this is the online data you can get from primarily the online marketplaces, with the sales numbers being the number one thing. You did mention it before, but yeah, the stock you can kind of put any number you want, really. Amazon and Alibaba don't typically go to your warehouse to check that you have 50 or 50,000 pairs of sneakers, but those sales numbers tend to be a lot more accurate. And if you can find a seller that's got, a huge volume of sales already, this is the data you're going to want to be collecting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, in that, right, talking about, the online data, I think another kind of jumping point is, having a sample purchase, having a test purchase to be able to then also verify that counterfeit product. So, in addition to being able to identify how much volume they're selling, it's also very important to then, confirm that it is in fact a counterfeit object, a counterfeit product. And depending on where you are, in what country you are, in China, you want that to be notarized. So there's slightly different flows depending on which country you're, talking about and addressing counterfeits in. But that's another key component is, that verification process.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. I mean, you're proving then that I went to this shop, I went through the sales process that everyone would go through, and this is the item, and we as the brand can confirm this is not ours, that this is a counterfeit.
Yeah, absolutely right. Because, online investigations can be, really incredible in being able to identify, very low prices. You can often tell by the photos that they're counterfeit. There's a lot of things that you can really pretty clearly identify counterfeits online, but having that physical product, as evidence does go a long way.
Yeah. So we've talked about the online evidence. We've also got the offline evidence, which is usually a lot trickier to get, and it generally involves working in collaboration with local police departments.
hmm Yeah, absolutely. So I think at this point, you're talking about potentially doing an on-site investigation, a raid, working with local police, to go into these warehouses and these factories and see the volume and the stock that they've got, on site.
Yeah, as a recent revenue recovery program, we won't name the customer. We'll say it's a premium French cosmetics brands. But they were able to actually conduct a raid in China with the local Chinese police. And I think they hit two warehouses and they got, hundreds of fake items. This was valued at tens of thousands of euros. And I think they got even, six people put into jail, even at this stage from this raid.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, there is probably nothing like walking into one of these warehouses and being able to see all of these counterfeit products. So yeah, I mean, especially in China, where raids are more common, that's definitely a tool that is in your tool belt for revenue recovery.
Yeah. I mean, being able to partner with the police,
Mhm.
I mean, as you said, especially in China, will literally open doors for you, whether you're kicking them open or not.
Yeah, and I think that is a really good point, Ryan. So one of the things to mention, with on-site investigations, raids, it is absolutely critical that you work with local investigators and local law enforcement, trying to do some of those activities, from remotely from another country. There's so much cultural nuance and understanding that you have to have in relationships. So I will say too, with that, especially in China, it's so important that you can find a reliable partner in country, to run like that entire process, because timing is also really important. With these on-site raids, you want to make sure that you hit the warehouse when there's the most stock. You don't want them to have just sent out their entire stock of everything and, their warehouse is empty, right? So I think, timing is really critical. The timing between investigators and law enforcement is really critical. So that's another thing to mention, is that, this coordination component is also very important, especially when you're talking about, external to the United States countries.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this takes us on to our next step, onto step 3, which will be working with legal representation. So obviously you will be working with lawyers for a revenue recovery program, and choosing a proven law firm can really make or break, the success of this program. So what would we say are the, biggest criteria for what is a proven or the perfect law firm to work with?
Yeah, so I think it's really important that you partner, again, with a law firm that has local knowledge. So looking at where your counterfeits are coming from and where you have, your primary concerns are, because again, they'll have experience with the local nuances, and they'll be able to, help coordinate in the language and within the cultural bounds. So I think that really is kind of key, is finding, a law firm partner that is experienced in the specific, kind of niche area.
Yeah, it's the geography, and it's also the industry.
Mhm.
Um, these different verticals have different nuances. Um, you know, fashion law in, I can hear your dog just in the background trying to get in. The IP of fashion in China is going to be very different to electronics in the United States. So if you can find a legal provider that's going to have experience in the vertical and in the actual geographic area, that's huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I apologize about my dogs. But, I think one of the other things too to consider when you're looking at a law firm, is contingency versus non-contingency basis. How much risk is your brand taking on, in starting a revenue recovery program?
Yeah, it's. I mean, I think accessibility is the word, because this is not a cheap process, as we've said. But this contingency basis, if you can qualify and find legal representation that will work on a contingency basis, then you're essentially doing this, at zero risk. If you've got to, as we said, cross off the criteria that we went through at the start. But yeah, if you have this confidence and you can get a contingency basis, it's huge. I mean, why would you not at least try and go for it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I mean, being able to go into something of this caliber with essentially, zero or no risk is really, that's a great place to be.
Yeah, I think so. So with that, we are going to move on to our next step, which is taking actions against counterfeiters. So we've already talked very briefly about the raids, being able to work with the police to get the doors open, actually get into these counterfeiting operations. Um, I think there's also a lot of strategies you can do for timing on these raids. Um, you know, these warehouses are obviously strategizing around major selling events. So, in the West, I think the biggest one is going to be Black Friday. If you're looking at China, I think 11/11, I think that's Singles Day. Um, if you can coordinate a raid just prior, like a few days or a week or two prior to one of these major selling events, this is when the warehouses are going to be at their absolute fullest.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, as we mentioned earlier, that's so critical because it just goes so much further improving, how much volume they're really moving. And I think, another thing to mention with these on site raids is, in addition to confiscating products, which is incredible, you can confiscate manufacturing materials, you can confiscate equipment. I mean, it really kind of transcends the entire, counterfeit operation, which, you're not just taking counterfeit products out of circulation, you're, putting a complete stop to entire operations, which I think is really powerful.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's I think the ultimate counter to the sort of whack-a-mole phenomenon that we rightfully hear a lot in brand protection, that it's great we can take down listings, but if the same people are putting up the same listing with a couple of changes next week, then what's the point? But if you're there with police and you're seizing manufacturing equipment and collecting their stock and freezing assets, that's huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And being able to freeze these assets is crippling for these organizations. To be able to freeze their bank accounts, to freeze accounts that they do business on online marketplaces, that really puts a stop to their entire business. And at the end of the day, they are a business.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think that also goes a really long way.
Yeah. I mean, I think your ability to do that will vary a lot in different jurisdictions, but I think in China, this is very often possible. Early on in the process, before the counterfeiters are even aware of what you're doing, being able to freeze their bank accounts, you can apply for something called property preservation, which is going to, help stop the counterfeiters from, you know, setting their illegal stocks ablaze before you can actually take it and seize it. Yeah, if you can get property preservation, if you can get these motions in early, then you'll be protecting a lot of your own evidence down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, and I think that is such an important component, in addition to timing, it is being able to preserve evidence and form a stronger case. One of the other things that I wanted to mention, in doing all of these actions is I think, this is such a strong deterrent for counterfeiters. One of the things that we see is, these counterfeiters are businesses, and their business model is to find products to counterfeit. I mean, counterfeiting, unfortunately, has been around for probably almost as long as people have.
Yeah,
Um, so I think, and it will continue to be around, but I think, doing something like a revenue recovery program and really having an impact against these brands, offline and shutting down their entire business operation sends a really strong message that your brand is not to be messed with, and they will eventually be deterred from picking on you and find somebody else that's less fortunate to pick on. So I think that's also this kind of idea of deterrency is also a really important component of revenue recovery programs.
yeah. I mean, I think you said it great. I think, you're not. It's going to be very difficult to, get these counterfeiters to totally change their ways to get a legitimate job. But, you know, a a major action you can do is by saying, this brand is not going to put up with this. And if you can push them at least to move on to a different brand to focus their efforts on, for your business, that's a huge win.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can't bail out the ocean with a thimble, but you can at least make sure that your own boat is dry, right?
Well put. Um, I think as well, just going back to the online, yeah, being able to seize web domains and
Mhm.
things like seller accounts is also huge. We see a lot. It's always very satisfying when we can take down a web domain and then you visit it afterwards, and instead of the big fake marketplace, it's just a big symbol saying this has been reclaimed by the brand.
Yeah, absolutely. Being able to take back those web domains and then park them and put a message like that up that's got to be so satisfying as a brand owner. And it's a great message to consumers as well that, you take brand protection very seriously and you take, their safety and their security very seriously. Because, one of the things that I think consumers often forget about these counterfeit products is, they're made with inferior materials that potentially have chemicals and all sorts of other things that are, really bad.
Yeah.
So I think it says a lot, as a brand to be protecting your consumers.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I mean, if you're, especially if you're thinking of industries like baby products or
Mhm.
food or anything that goes into like a vehicle, it's not just, brands losing money. This is genuine risk to consumers.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's some very real safety concerns with these counterfeit products. And in addition to that, counterfeits are also very heavily linked with, other nefarious activities, right? From unfair labor to other types of, kind of underworld style dealings. So they're so much more insidious than what they appear to be just, on the surface.
Yeah, if they're doing counterfeiting, they're guaranteed to be committing other crimes. I've yet to hear of a counterfeiter that's still paying their taxes fully, properly every year. Yeah, so I mean, this brings us on to the actual final step, the litigation negotiation um, sides. This is where, for you as a brand, this is where you're going to get your payout. Um, the the most common final step that we're seeing is the negotiation between the brand and its legal representation and the counterfeiters to, you know, put a stop to the um, actual case, to get this payout, to get the damages directly from them.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And there's kind of two main paths, and they're different, right? So you've got civil settlement and kind of that negotiation that you'd been, touching on, and then there's also the criminal proceedings. So those are kind of depending on the country and the location and the local law enforcement that you're working with, and all of these other, varying factors. Those are kind of, two potential avenues as well as overlapping avenues as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about sending a message, as we were before, being able to get criminal prosecution against counterfeiters is absolutely huge. And it's definitely something that the police that you've been working with are going to be very interested in as well. You mentioned the other crimes that they'll be committing a couple of minutes ago. So, once you've opened this door, once you've sort of lifted this rock and had a look underneath, the police are going to be very happy to help you get some of these people locked up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, yeah, so this is the whole process. If you've been able to build your case properly, work with the right law firm, and conduct your revenue recovery program right, then after a few months, I think in China up to a couple of years, you can be pretty confident of a pretty healthy payout.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these can, have very high yields, especially if the targets are identified appropriately. And this can be a really successful solution for a lot of brands.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's everything we wanted to cover today, unless we've missed anything out.
I think that's it.
Okay. Well, Jess, thank you very much for joining me today. To everyone that's been watching, thank you very much. We'll be talking about similar topics over the next few weeks. We'll be talking about case building and partnerships for brand protection. So yeah, watch this space.